An everyday BEETZ perspective on coaching and leading. And today I will focus on kind of the next letter in the BEETZ. We spoke, the first aspect of the model is this idea of brokering, meaning like to connect, and there are different ways of thinking about connecting. The second letter, the first E, stands for embedding. So in this short video, I'll talk a bit about that idea of embedding, what I mean by that, how it relates to coaching. Again, this model comes from about 10 years of research on leadership and organizations, and coaches being part of that leadership. So that's these ideas, these five principles that we could talk about in this model are not meant to be kind of an all-encompassing kind of list for how to coach. They're rather five ideas that coaches can consider, five ideas that might help coaches practice better in what we call the everyday, in the kind of the everyday work that they do. That's the focus of this model. First, I want to start off with a couple of short stories that relate to this idea of embedding. A couple of years ago, you may recall, you may or may not, you may have seen this. The NFL Network started airing these games football games on Thursday nights, and they tried a number of kind of promotions relating to those games, and one of them was the uniforms that the players started wearing. I think they called them Color Blast or something like that. Where the teams would wear all one color, so all green. The Jets would wear all green. The Bills all red. This was a particular game in which, while many of us saw this picture, a lot of other people saw a picture that looked a lot, indistinguishable. So in a particular game between the Jets and the Bills, the one team was wearing all red, one team was wearing all green. For those of you who might be colorblind, the game may have been very difficult to watch because if you're colorblind, you have a hard time distinguishing between red and green. And so, on one hand, that could sound like a really kind of trivial thing, but what we may not realize is that 8% of men are colorblind, and in this particular audience who watches Thursday Night Football, about 7.65 million viewers, 7.65 million viewers watch this Thursday Night Football game, this particular game. So 8% of that is about 600,000 viewers. So about 600,000 viewers who are watching the Bills play the Jets, all red versus all green, we're having a nearly impossible time watching these teams play. A lot of people saw a very kind of cool green versus red, but a bunch of other people saw just a bunch of players that looked like they were wearing the same thing. 600,000 viewers, so kind of not a small deal, not a minor thing. It was a kind of a mistake that the NFL Network caught a lot of flack about. So that's one story. I want to share another story. It seems completely related, and it is unrelated, other than I think there's a connection that I can draw. This is a picture of what was many years ago, in the mid-1800s. One of my favorite leaders that you may hear me talk a lot about, and a lot of people talk about, is Abraham Lincoln. And I've read just a whole lot about Abraham Lincoln, admire him in so many ways. Before we all know him as President of the United States, who did so many things, and one of the best, recognized as one of the best presidents ever. But long before he was president, he was what they would call a prairie lawyer in kind of the Springfield, Illinois area. And as a prairie lawyer in the mid-1800s, his work was a lot different than what we might now know as an attorney in the present day. And a lot of the work of a lawyer that Abraham Lincoln quickly realized was getting to know people and getting to know people in a community. So when he first moved to this area outside of Springfield, he was training to become a lawyer. He was just becoming a lawyer, but he kind of a curious decision. He decided he wanted to work and take up, kind of reside in a general store. This is a picture of the general store. It was kind of on the outside of town, and he spent a lot of time working there, spending time there. And why did he do that? Why did he spend time at that general store? One of the reasons, the main reason, was that this at that time was a place where kind of everybody came through on their way in or out of town. If they needed something, if they just wanted to visit, it was where everybody kind of stopped through. So it was, Abraham Lincoln didn't really care about selling things at the store or that kind of thing, but what he did care about was getting to know the people in that community where he had just moved. So in a short amount of time, he became kind of a beloved figure in that town, not just because he was a lawyer or a nice guy, but because he was very strategic about where he spent his time. He was very strategic about kind of where he set up shop, and he became a very kind of trusted face in town, someone that everybody knew. And a lot of it was due to kind of where he was. He was in this space, and he did that very specifically. He went to that place. So why do I start this with this discussion of embeddedness with these two seemingly completely different stories? They are different, but this idea of embeddedness it relates to kind of how we get as a coach, how coaches get close to the action. Are they close to the action? Where are they close to the action? And why is that important? Both of these stories are stories about that. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. With the Lincoln case, clearly he became embedded in this little general store, which was where everyone passed through. So he developed relationships because he did that. In the story of the NFL Network and the green and red uniforms, that was an example of a lack of embeddedness. That there was this kind of big blind spot in those who planned the game, those who kind of put a lot of resources into that. Obviously, it's a very big operation, but nobody kind of realized that this is going to be a big problem for 600,000 viewers. Because there was this kind of organizational blind spot. No one was kind of bringing that vantage point of someone who's colorblind to the table. So when it comes to coaching, a lot of coaches enter into the profession for certain reasons. They love a game. They love, for example, football. They maybe grew up playing football and love the game. They want to be close to it, want to teach the game. Some people, that's one of the most common reasons that I think a lot of you who are watching this might fall into that category. You love a sport. And then the other, very common reason is they want to, be close to the athletes and help them develop, help them to grow, help them become better people, not just in the learning the game and becoming better at the game, but in helping them to learn life lessons and to develop as kind of really good people. Those are two really common parts of being a coach. And often when we enter the profession at whatever level, whether it's like at a college level, as for example, the example of football, or you could take any other sport, and you could see this picture and this here, and you could see that if you're like a graduate assistant in a college football program, or if you're like a position coach, you're really close to the action. You're really close to the particular, say you're a receivers coach in football. You're working every day with kind of a small group of receivers, and you're working on helping them develop their skill sets around being a receiver. You're developing close relationships with them, and so you can really kind of feel the impact of what you're doing. But a common challenge we find in coaching, and we find this actually, I work in a school of education. We find this a lot in schools, like with school teachers. If you're a really good school teacher, for example, let's say that you're a high school history teacher, and you're really good at it, and you love it, you're really good at it, you get recognized for being really good at it. What often happens to those teachers is they have a big impact, and they often get promoted. They often get promoted to like a school principal job, for example. And while they may love that work, a problem that a lot of those teachers have, this is a picture, an exaggeration here, but they go from something they love, which is being right in the action with students every day. They're teaching them. They're helping kids learn. They're able to be creative, and then all of a sudden they become in charge of something like a whole school, for example, and they get removed from what they really care about. They get removed from the actual daily interactions with students, and they're focusing on paperwork or on budgets and oversight of staff, and very quickly they can get kind of disoriented, because even though they may still be working in a school, in this case, they're not doing the work that they actually love, that they were drawn to. And this is seen also in coaching, where you maybe again, if you were, let's go back to that football example, you're the receivers coach, you're really, really good at it, you get promoted up to a coordinator position, then all of a sudden before you know it, you're a head coach, and you're more of almost like a CEO of a big organization than you are like working with the position that you did before. There certainly is still interaction, but it's very different. You're dealing with a whole range of different issues. That's common in coaching. That's common that as we move up the line, whether it's college, professional, or even to a certain extent at lower levels, at high school and that kind of thing, as we move to the head roles, we have to deal with a bunch of stuff that is not what we thought it would be. Fundraising, meeting with donors, meeting with compliance people, a bunch of things. So it's not only that we don't like it. That's not the whole deal. Like, that's part of it. We have to learn to like a new part of coaching. But another part of it, though, is this idea of these blind spots that we can develop if we don't continue to have some sort of closeness with kind of the front lines of action. We can, just like the Thursday night football example, we can develop these blind spots where we don't really know what's going on. So this discussion of embeddedness is how do we remain close to the action, either ourselves or making sure that people on our staffs, members of our unit, can remain embedded in different ways. We can't, as a leader, for example, you're a head coach in the NFL or in college sports, you can't be everywhere to everyone. You can't be spending time on the front lines of action all the time. But we can develop systems that kind of minimize some of these blind spots that we might have. So a quote that I like, which I read in the Brian Stevenson book, that was a kind of a UW campus book a couple of years ago. He talked about, you can't understand most of the important things from a distance. You have to get close. So as a coach, how do we remain close? How do we stay close to the things that matter? That's what the discussion of embeddedness is about. You may have heard the term embeddedness, sometimes not in coaching as much as you hear it a lot in the term embedded journalism. So an embedded journalist, for example, you hear it a lot when there's a war, and there will be a reporter will go along, embed with a particular unit in the military, and they'll travel with them. They will sometimes be kind of right up close to the action. And what's the logic of that? The logic of that is that reporter, by getting close to the action, embedded with the action, they learn more and more richly and deeper than they would just sitting in an office miles away. So that's you could think of the same logic with coaching. How do we think about embeddedness so that we can minimize these gaps in our perceptions? What do we perceive is going on in our teams? And really, gaps in our understanding of our teams, gaps in our understanding of our organizations. Particularly, when I have underlined here, gaps in our understanding across difference. It's one of the biggest, a big challenge that coaches have is that there are all these kind of clusters on teams of difference. There are around players versus coaches, the seniors or the older players in the team versus the younger ones, the veterans and the rookies, the seniors and the freshmen, new players and older players, trainers and coaches, differences along racial lines, differences along position lines. There are all kinds of differences on teams, and we get these gaps in understanding across them. How do we fill in some of those gaps? I'll talk about a few aspects of that. So one thing to think about with regard to embeddedness is what we could talk about as proximity. And I mean here like literally the physical space of our coaching, like where we spend our time, where members of our coaching staffs spend their time, where they interact with players, where they interact with each other, literally kind of the physical space where we are. And just think about that a little bit. Think about your own team or teams that you work with, and where do the coaches do their work, and where do the coaches interact with players, and how does that space, that physical space, affect the interactions? Why do I bring this up? So this is actually an area of research that I'm really interested in. I do a lot of this work. A lot of my work relates to proximity, and there's really kind of strong research that says geography is the substrate on which relationships are built. What that means is, as much as we talk about language, or we talk about strategy, or we talk about kind of all these really advanced kind of relational things, those things, all those conversations, those interactions, they take place in a physical space or a kind of a geography that kind of affects the way that those relationships unfold. And so if we don't think about literally that physical space, then we're kind of missing something. I'll give a couple of examples. I'm going to share a few examples relating to proximity. I would like you to think about your own physical space as I'm sharing these. These are not, again, all-encompassing examples. They're just a few to get you thinking about proximity and how it makes a difference. So one is, again, back to this is a picture of like an NFL training camp photo. If you've ever been to or participated in an NFL training camp, or just think of whatever sport it is that you participate in or you coach. This is a big operation. So there are hundreds of people out on a field, and a head coach in this case, can't be kind of talking to everybody, can't be knowing everything that's going on, which is fine. It's part of the deal. You hire a staff that's doing that work. You trust your staff. You let them do their work. But there can be a degree of detachment for a coach in this setting if he or she isn't kind of engaged in different ways. One example, at like an NFL training camp, this is a picture of Pete Carroll, the coach of the Seahawks, and there's interesting stories about him, and you can read about him. How before just about every practice and even before games, you'll see him down on the field, on this big field. He'll be down there throwing the ball to different people. So he gets down there and he really kind of lets it fly, and it's kind of funny to see. I think he's like the oldest coach in the league, and he's not like he is just recently was a player. But they ask, why do you do that? Why are you down the field throwing the ball, having a good time? And he said, well, I love the game, and I have to get kind of like literally a feel for it. I want to touch the ball. I want to throw the ball. I want to engage in kind of the game itself to get me grounded for coaching, and how important that was for him to be embedded literally in the game, to get a feel for the game. It's one example of how it's a simple kind of small, almost silly thing that he does, but he wants to be in the space and actually active in the game. This is not something all coaches are going to do, but it's his way of not just being the administrator, not just being the guy who's looked so far. It's a way of getting close to actually the game itself. It's one way that he talks about being embedded. Another example, I went and visited a bunch of different athletic departments and visited with coaches and athletic directors and different people from around the country over the last couple of years to learn about different places and to learn about this idea of embeddedness and different things. One of the places that I'll end up sharing a lot of examples about, and this is one example, is from Stanford. And from their campus, I took this picture when you go into their kind of sport, where their athletic offices are. And this is just when you enter, it shows the where all the offices are, where each team is located and what is present. And one of the things that jumped out at me right away at Stanford, and it turns out it is purposeful, is that a lot of the offices are kind of integrated across sport, across gender, across kind of departmental areas. They're not all kind of isolated in their own area. So, for example, when I went in to visit with some people there, I saw the head football coach was in the lobby and visiting with the volleyball coach and some other administrators who were not directly related to football. And it was because literally their offices are in proximity to each other, all these different places. And when I asked about that, I said, "Why? That's a little different than a lot of places. You can look at where all these offices are." It was purposeful that they wanted their whole department to be kind of integrated in different ways across sport, so that they would have kind of a camaraderie that was not just sport specific, and it made a difference literally that their offices were by each other. They had these casual interactions with each other. I'll share another example, and there's an article about this as well, about the Calgary Flames hockey team, and they talk about how important kind of the proximity of lockers in the locker room, how important that proximity is, that they're very purposeful about who sits where in the locker room and why they sit there and what those dynamics have on the team. You could probably think about any team you have and the importance of where people sit in given spaces. Maybe it's in a meeting room when you're having meetings. Maybe it's in the locker room. Maybe it's on the bus, on the plane. There are certain kind of rituals about where people sit, and that can be purposeful. So as a coach, you can think about some of those things about, well, where am I sitting? Where am I spending time? And why? Why am I in these spaces? And where is my staff? Where are my players in proximity to us and to each other? In just some of these everyday spaces where we spend our time. In this example, the Calgary Flames, some of the veterans tended to be in the middle of the room. The people that were the kind of the role models were in the center for a very specific reason. One last example of a proximity thing I'll share with you is, this is a familiar face to a lot of people. It's former Wisconsin running back Lamar Soup Campbell, who works for the Chicago Bears, and his job is to kind of be engaged with the players, director of player engagement, or I don't remember his exact title, but Soup was very specific when he went to the Bears in asking for an office that would be right outside of the player locker room, because his job it's kind of like the Abraham Lincoln example. He knew that his job was to develop relationships, and he wanted not to be far removed from where all the players were, but right close to where they would be, so when they're coming in and out of the locker room with frequency, his door is open, he's right there. There's a kind of an everyday interaction that's just natural, and that he said was very important to him. It's been a very big part of his job as he's working with the Bears. So these are all examples. This one, the one at Stanford, the locker room example, the Pete Carroll getting down on the field example of proximity, of space, of how we can think about being embedded in space in different ways. So reflect upon that. Reflect upon the space where you are as a coach. How would you think things could even be better in terms of where you spend your time? how you spend your time and what you learn, you and your staff learn in those different places. I'll say just another aspect of embeddedness is getting embedded in identity matters. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So, being close to members of our team is not just about physical, the physical layout, proximity, but it's also to kind of like being close to and embedded in different aspects of identity and of who we are, of who members of your team are. I'll give an example. A lot of my examples end up being basketball because I have a basketball background, but this is a coach named Michael Malone. He's the head coach of the Denver Nuggets, and a lot has been written about him for a variety of reasons in terms of being a really good coach, and his team has been successful. One of the really interesting things you'll read about him is that he, in the off season, while a lot of coaches are doing a lot of development in terms of learning about the scheme they'll use or the scouting or kind of organizational planning, he does all that. But another of his commitments in the off season and even during the season is to get embedded in the identities of his players. And an example of that is relating to one example of this is in the off season, he has a number of players on the Nuggets are from all around the world. They're from Europe and from all different parts of the world. So he will go, there's a story about how he went to in a recent off season, he went and spent time in Serbia with the family of one of his best players, of Jokic, one of the best players on the Nuggets. And he did that. He took the time to fly over there and spend time with Nikola Jokic's family and to learn about his hometown, to see where he grew up, where he spent his time, to learn about what was important to his family, to see the spaces where he learned the game. He knew that was important for him as a teacher and coach, so that he would, when they're working together back in the U.S. in Denver or wherever they're playing throughout the NBA season, he has that in the back of his mind. This is where Jokic is from. He's from Serbia, and I know about something his parents taught him or he went through. I know his parents. I know his family members. I know what he cares about. I can visualize his hometown, and I can work with him now in a different way as a coach than if I didn't know any of that. This example is not to say that every coach needs to go to every player's hometown and to know everything about every single person, but it is to say that we can get embedded in the identity. He knew that for this player that was important to him, that he felt pride in where he was from, and he felt attached to his family. So he knew as a coach, I need to get to know this. I need to know more about this young man, and it will help me as a coach, but it will also mean a lot to the player. In a similar way, the one thing that Michael Malone does is he has, again, a number of international players on his team. When he drives to and from the arena, I don't know if he actually does this every time, but he listens to like Rosetta Stone to try to learn the different languages, even a little bit of the languages of each of his players, getting embedded in their identities, and literally so he can communicate with them better, but also to show them that he cares, to show them, look, I'm trying to learn some part of your language. I'm trying to learn some part of your hometown or of your family. And that matters. That matters to the players. His players have come to love him. He's known, even when players leave their team, they keep in touch with him. He's developed an identity as a coach, as someone who gets embedded in the lives of players in a deeper way than many other coaches, especially in something like the NBA, which is very much a business. He gets embedded in a different way than many others do, with great effects. So think about that. As a coach, how are you, or would you like to be in the future, embedded in different ways in the identities of your players? It could be around language, it could be around hometown, it could be around cultural things, it could be It could be a range of things. And again, think of this not just as an individual coach, but as the leader of a unit, meaning how would your staff get embedded in different ways? How would your staff learn in different ways? Not just in space, but also in identity. Then the last example I'll share, which is related to the other two, is about context matters. So this is, again, the final example. What means that the kind of, we could say, the tenor of the space shapes the nature of interactions. And I say the tenor of the space, here's what I mean. Like, when you're, again, like a basketball coach and you're on the court giving instruction, you're on the court teaching about defensive positioning, or you're on the court teaching about kind of the technique, that space has a certain impact on the way you interact with. It's a very formal interaction, and that's good, and that's the heart of the work in any sport, that you're doing instruction in the space where competition occurs. That is at the heart of what we do. That's critical. There are these other spaces. Think about the other spaces where you as a coach interact with players, or where you will interact with players. Another place you could think of maybe for some coaches is like literally the coach's office. So if a player goes to the coach's office, maybe the coach wants to talk about, well, what's going on? You're not, like, you need to pick it up. You're not maximizing your talents and abilities. I don't like your attitude. That kind of thing often gets discussed in a coach's office. It's very, very common. Again, appropriate. It could be also a positive interaction in the coach's office. Again, as someone who's coming from education, I think about this as like a principal's office. Like if a teacher or a student gets called to a principal's office, that space sets the tenor of the interaction. It's a very formal, in some ways, it could be a nerve-wracking place. If you ever were called to the principal's office, like I was as a student, there's a certain tenor, there's a certain kind of tension that can be in that space that creates an impact on that interaction. Again, it's necessary sometimes, but it is not it's not the only place you want the interactions to occur. So where else are interactions had? What other kinds of contexts? We have these formal contexts. One example that's been written about a lot is the San Antonio Spurs basketball team. The coach is Greg Popovich, and this is a picture of the Spurs team a couple years back. Greg Popovich, the head coach, is known to have these team dinners. So whenever when the Spurs are on the road traveling, they'll play a game, and then they'll rent out like the back room of a restaurant very frequently, and they all will go together. They all will go eat together. They'll eat and drink together, and this is rare in the NBA for teams to do this. And he has certain kind of rules about that context. He says we're not going to talk about basketball. We'll talk about things like politics or events that are happening in the public, talk about families, about stories from growing up. But they don't have these dinners to kind of like rehash the game. Everybody kind of mixes up at the tables. They sit in different groups. It's not just players sitting alone or veterans sitting alone. Everybody is interspersed at a long table. They mix it up. Again, it's important that they're all literally in the same space, but it's also important that they're not just talking about basketball. They're talking about life. They're getting to know each other in a deeper way. And when you read about Popovich, that's a lot of people admire him for his basketball knowledge, but even more, I think a lot of people look up to him for the way he develops relationships on his team. And some of that relates to this stuff we're talking about today. How is he embedded? He's embedded not just in formal contexts on the court, in the office, but he also becomes embedded in informal ones, in spaces where they can learn about each other and enjoy each other. So this is what this discussion of embeddedness is like, how do we as coaches, even as we progress up the ladder, stay close to the action. It could be a really small, kind of trivial thing like the Pete Carroll example, get out on the field and throw in passes just so he can feel the football and remember what it feels like to play. It could be in more formal things like the way we lay out our locker room, like the Calgary Flames. It could be like the Abraham Lincoln and Soup Campbell example of how we have a space that's frequently passed by in informal ways. It could be routines that we develop, like the Greg Popovich example of getting embedded with the lives of those on your team at like a dinner or in others, having people to your home in a different context because context matters. It could be like the Michael Malone example of getting embedded in other parts, learning about a family, learning about language that matters to your team. So that's what this idea of embeddedness is getting at. It's an everyday thing. On an everyday basis, how are we embedded? And it's to eliminate some of these gaps that develop. Is to eliminate the glaring gap that the NFL Network had of 600,000 people. They had no one on their team who came with that perspective when they were making their plans. So think about what perspectives might be missing out in your coaching. What perspectives could you learn from, and how could you use this idea of embeddedness to better prepare to eliminate gaps in understanding? So a question we might think about is, how do you learn from and understand those who are different from you in your team or organization? How do you learn from and understand those who are different from you in your team or organization? We tend to cluster around similarity. We tend to cluster coaches, meet with coaches, players with players, and then we cluster around all other kinds of identity variables. So how do we learn from those who are different in our group in order that we all might be better? That's a kind of an embeddedness reflection question. So we're moving along in the BEETZ model to the B of brokering and the first E of embeddedness. Thanks for your time today.